Mommy is a sick, dangerous woman, Maya. She's not coming back. Those words echoed through the tiny, tinny speaker of my phone, sharp and metallic, slicing through the howl of the wind. I was listening through a two-way baby monitor app, a simple, innocuous square of code that my husband thought he had permanently deleted from my device 3 weeks ago. It was a phone call that shouldn't exist, a live, high-definition broadcast of my own assassination. I was standing on the concrete expanse of my own front porch, completely engulfed in the white-out fury of a December Denver blizzard. The ambient temperature had plummeted to 12 degrees below zero, and the wind chill made it feel like I was breathing in microscopic shards of shattered glass. I was 26 years old. I was wearing nothing but a pair of thin, seafoam blue hospital scrubs, the front of which were still wet with dishwater, and a single white cotton sock on my left foot. My right foot was already turning a mottled, sickly white, the bare skin freezing fast to the jagged, ice-coated concrete beneath me. My teeth were chattering so violently with such uncontrollable percussive force that the relentless clicking echoed in my own skull, and I was genuinely terrified my molars would splinter into fragments. 10 seconds earlier, my husband Elias had grabbed the collar of my scrubs, shoved me backward by my throat with a force that lifted me off my toes, kicked my remaining shoe out the door into the snowbank, and thrown the heavy brass deadbolt. The sound of that lock, a deep, resonant, metallic clack, was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I had no winter coat, no car keys, no purse, and nowhere to go in a storm that was currently burying the city. Inside, where the heavy oak floors were heated and the air smelled of expensive red wine and wood smoke, he was kneeling down, looking into the terrified blue eyes of our 4-year-old daughter, and telling her that her mother had willingly abandoned her to the freezing night. 14 hours later, a family court judge sat in a silent, mahogany-paneled room that smelled faintly of lemon floor wax and old paper, and listened to that exact recording. When the judge heard the sickening, unmistakable click of that deadbolt sliding into place over the courtroom's audio system, Elias's face drained of all color. The smug, patrician flush of his cheeks vanished, turning his skin the shade of spoiled milk. He looked at me across the aisle, his pristine tailoring suddenly looking like a costume that was entirely too big for him. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with a frantic, suffocating terror I had never seen in him before. His hands began to tremble so violently that his expensive gold pen clattered against the defense table. But to understand why I had to freeze on that porch to get my daughter back, to understand the agonizing, systematic destruction of my sanity, and how I methodically built the invisible steel cage that eventually swallowed him whole, you need to know how quietly the trap was set. My name is Jessa Caldwell. I grew up in the kind of suffocating generational poverty that teaches you from a very young age to be entirely invisible. My grandmother Edith raised me in a rust-streaked, single-wide trailer on the dusty, sun-baked outskirts of Pueblo, Colorado. We didn't have money for after-school extracurriculars or new winter clothes or summer vacations to the mountains. We had sheer, brutal survival. Our home perpetually smelled of sun-heated aluminum, cheap menthol cigarettes, and the sharp chemical tang of pine sol used to scrub away the desert dust. My grandmother was a hard, deeply practical woman whose skin was tanned to the texture of worn saddle leather. She smoked 2 packs a day and worked grueling night shifts at a commercial laundry facility, coming home smelling of industrial bleach and exhaustion. She didn't offer warm, comforting hugs when I scraped my knee, nor did she bake chocolate chip cookies to celebrate a good report card. She offered nothing but harsh, unfiltered realities. I distinctly remember being 12 years old, sitting on the peeling linoleum floor of our narrow kitchen, crying so hard I was hyperventilating. A girl at my middle school named Stacy had cornered me by the lockers and stolen my only pair of winter gloves, thick wool mittens my grandmother had bought me from a thrift store. I was too terrified of Stacy's older brothers to confront her, so I walked home in the freezing sleet with my hands tucked under my armpits. My grandmother stood at the stove, boiling water for pasta. She turned around, taking a long, deliberate drag of her cigarette, and looked at me through the thick, gray haze of smoke. "Stop that blubbering, Jessa. Tell me what happened," she demanded, her voice like grinding gravel. "Stacy Miller took my gloves," I sobbed, wiping my nose on my frayed sleeve. "She just took them right out of my locker." "And what exactly did you do about it?" "I told her to give them back," I cried, my voice pitching up in defensive panic. "Did you make her give them back?" my grandmother pressed, stepping closer, the cherry of her cigarette glowing bright orange. "She's bigger than me, Gran, and her brothers are mean. I couldn't do anything." My grandmother sighed a long, tired sound that seemed to carry the weight of her entire difficult life. She knelt down, her knees popping loudly in the quiet kitchen. She didn't reach out to wipe my tears. Instead, she locked her dark, serious eyes onto mine and said the words that would, more than a decade later, eventually save my life. "A trapped bird doesn't scream, Jessa. It watches the hinges." "I don't know what that means," I hiccuped, shivering on the floor. "It means that making a lot of noise when you're overpowered is just a good way to get your neck wrung," she said flatly. "You don't fight a bigger dog by barking at it. You stay quiet. You watch how the cage is built. You find the weak spot. And when the door opens even a fraction of an inch, you don't hesitate. You fly." I didn't fully understand the profound gravity of it then. I thought she was just being dismissive, finding an excuse not to march down to the school and fight my battles for me. But over the years, as I navigated the harshness of a world that didn't care about poor girls from trailer parks, that philosophy sank deep into my marrow. I learned to stop reacting defensively. I learned to swallow my immediate emotional responses. I learned to watch. That became my invisible, silent superpower. I noticed things, small, seemingly insignificant things, the kind of microscopic details that arrogant people think absolutely nobody sees. I notice when a picture frame on a mantel has been moved a quarter of an inch to the left. I remember the exact, specific phrasing people use when they're weaving a lie, and how the cadence of their voice drops when they are finally telling the truth. I notice the involuntary twitch of a jaw muscle when someone is hiding anger. I don't argue when I'm wronged. I don't scream. I document. I catalog. I wait. That one fundamental thing about me, it's the sole reason this story has the ending it does. By the time I was 24, I had moved out of Pueblo, rented a tiny, drafty apartment in Denver, and clawed my way through nursing school while working double shifts as a waitress. I wasn't destined to be a surgeon saving the world, but I was determined to do something that fundamentally mattered. I became a hospice nurse. My job was to sit in quiet, sterile rooms with people at the very edge of the world and help them cross over into whatever comes next. The wards always smelled faintly of lavender masking agent, rubbing alcohol, and the distinct metallic scent of slow decay. I bathed my patients with warm sponges, meticulously administered their liquid morphine to ease their bone-deep agony, and held their frail, translucent hands when their own families couldn't bear the emotional weight of being in the room. You learn a terrifying amount about human nature in a hospice ward. Stripped of society's polite fictions, people reveal their true faces. You learn that people are rarely what they pretend to be in the daylight. You learn that the darkest, most unfathomable cruelty usually happens behind closed doors, perpetrated not by masked strangers in dark alleys, but by the very people who loudly claim to love you the most. I didn't know it then, but sitting in those quiet, dimly lit rooms, listening to the slow, rhythmic beep hiss of breathing monitors, and watching the subtle micro-expressions of grieving, and sometimes relieved relatives, I was undergoing rigorous training for the absolute war of my life. On a random, overcast Tuesday in late October, a Tuesday I still think about, with a cold shudder when the autumn air turns crisp, I stopped at a busy independent coffee shop on 17th Avenue after a grueling, emotionally devastating 14-hour overnight shift. I was bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that makes your vision blur at the edges. I was wearing my faded navy scrubs, my hair tied in a messy knot, smelling faintly of antibacterial soap, stale hospital coffee, and the lingering scent of a room where someone had just taken their final breath. I just wanted a massive cup of dark roast to keep me awake long enough to drive home and collapse. That's when I met Elias. He was standing in line directly ahead of me, radiating an aura of effortless success. He was tall, with perfectly styled dark hair, and he wore a tailored camel-colored wool overcoat that clearly cost more than my entire month's rent. As he pulled his phone from his pocket, his slim leather wallet slipped out, hitting the hardwood floor with a soft slap. I bent down, my knees aching, and picked it up. "Excuse me," I said, my voice raspy from lack of sleep. "You drop this." He turned around. The moment his eyes met mine, he flashed a brilliant, perfectly white smile that could have sold useless real estate to a seasoned nomad. It was a smile engineered to disarm. "Oh, wow. My entire life is in there," he said, taking the wallet with a warm chuckle. "Thank you so much. I would have been stranded." "No problem," I mumbled, offering a tired, polite smile in return. "Happens to the best of us." His eyes swept over my rumpled scrubs, the dark circles under my eyes, and my slumped posture. His expression softened into something that looked exactly like genuine, profound empathy. "You look like you've been fighting a war," he said, his voice dropping to a gentle, soothing register. "Just fighting time," I replied, too tired to offer a witty deflection. "Well, whatever front line you just came from, you deserve a medal, or at the very least caffeine," he said, turning to the barista. "I'm Elias, by the way, and I'm buying whatever you're drinking." "I'm Jessa, and you really don't have to do that," I protested, my cheeks flushing slightly. "It was just a wallet." "I insist, Jessa," he smiled, stepping closer so I could smell his cologne. Something expensive, sharp, with notes of cedar and bergamot. Black coffee, or something highly complicated with an umbrella. "Dark roast. Biggest size you have," I said. "I need the electricity." Elias Thornton was 30 years old. He was a senior architect for a highly successful mid-sized commercial firm in downtown Denver. He was polished, flawlessly articulate, and moved through the world with the absolute confidence of a man who had never been told no. To a girl who grew up shivering in a drafty aluminum trailer, constantly waiting for the next financial disaster to strike, he looked like absolute impenetrable safety. He looked like a harbor in a perpetual storm. We fell into a dizzying whirlwind romance that completely swept me off my feet. He was intoxicating. He planned elaborate surprise dates. He took me to the Denver Botanic Gardens on a freezing Sunday afternoon, leading me into the heavy, wet heat of the tropical orchid pavilion. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming vanilla, and as condensation gathered on the glass walls, he pulled me into his heavy wool coat and kissed me until my head spun. When I was too utterly exhausted to cook after a brutal string of night shifts, he would show up at my tiny apartment with gourmet Thai takeout, a bottle of imported wine, and a gentle smile. "Sit down. Take off your shoes," he would murmur, rubbing my aching shoulders. "Let me take care of you. You spend your whole life taking care of everyone else, Jessa. It's your turn." He constantly told me I was the most pure, genuine person he had ever met. He told me the women in his social circle were shallow and materialistic, but I was different. I was real. God, we were so incredibly happy. I was so happy. And I had absolutely no idea what he was meticulously doing behind my back every single one of those days. Looking back with the cold clarity of hindsight, the warning signs weren't just red flags. They were a deafening, brightly lit parade. But when you've grown up in survival mode, when you've never truly had someone else step in and take the heavy burdens off your shoulders, absolute control can feel an awful lot like love. The very first subtle sign, the first real, tangible crack in the facade, happened 3 months before our lavish, Elias-funded wedding. We were at a sophisticated dinner party at the home of one of his wealthy architect partners. The dining room was illuminated by a modern chandelier, the table set with crystal wine glasses and heavy silver cutlery. The air smelled of roasted lamb and rosemary. The conversation had turned to my work. I was quietly telling a story about a patient I had helped that week, an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy who had been frantically, deliriously searching his bedsheets for his lost wedding ring. I had spent an hour combing through the laundry carts until I found it, just so he could die with it on his finger. The table was silent, listening intently. I felt vulnerable, sharing such an intimate moment of my work. Elias reached over under the table. He put his large hand on my thigh. But he didn't just rest it there. He gripped my leg, his fingers digging into my muscle with a sudden, vicious force, squeezing hard enough that I knew it would leave a dark, ugly bruise. I gasped softly, startled by the sudden pain, and looked at him. He was smiling broadly at the host. "Jess has such an incredibly big heart," Elias told the table, his tone dripping with a bizarre, patronizing amusement. "She gets so wrapped up in these little melodramas. She's so simple. Bless her." I froze. The host's wife chuckled awkwardly, taking a sip of her wine. "I just wanted him to have some peace," I said softly, trying to pull my leg away, but his grip only tightened like an iron vise. "Of course you did, sweetie," Elias laughed, patting my leg forcefully before releasing it. "But it's just a piece of metal. You missed our dinner reservations that night looking for trash in a laundry bin. Her priorities are endearingly skewed." I stopped talking for the rest of the evening. The table moved on to discussing golf courses in Aspen. As I sat there, the throbbing pain in my thigh pulsing in time with my heartbeat, I told myself he just used the wrong word. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself he was just trying to keep the conversation light. It wasn't nothing. It was a test. He was testing the perimeter of my compliance. The second major sign was the deliberate, systematic restructuring of my reality. It started with small things. I would come home, lock the front door, and drop my car keys into the small ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter, exactly where I'd put them every single day for 2 years. The sound of the keys hitting the ceramic was a daily ritual. But in the morning, when I was rushing to get dressed for a shift, the bowl would be empty. I would panic, my heart racing, tearing through my purse and jacket pockets. Eventually, I would find them sitting perfectly centered on the top shelf of the bookcase in the living room. "Elias, did you move my keys?" I asked one morning, my brow furrowed in confusion. He looked up from his iPad, his expression a mask of gentle, concerned patience. "They were on the bookshelf, Jessa. But I left them in the bowl on the counter. I know I did. I remember the sound of them dropping." He sighed, standing up and walking over to me. He placed his hands on my shoulders, looking deeply into my eyes. "You're getting so forgetful lately, Jess. You're exhausted." "I really thought I put them in the bowl," I whispered, my confidence wavering. "You didn't? You came in yesterday and you were practically sleepwalking," he said, shaking his head with a patronizing, pitying smile. "You need to sleep more. The stress of the hospice ward is getting to you. You're losing your mind a little bit, honey." I believed him. I didn't trust my own memory over the certainty in his eyes. I thought the relentless proximity to death and dying was finally fracturing my cognitive function. I started doubting my own reality. We got married in a beautiful ceremony that I had almost no hand in planning because Elias insisted on handling all the stressful details. A year later, we had Maya. Maya was a beautiful, quiet, highly observant baby with my dark, thick hair and Elias's piercing blue eyes. I remember lying in the stark, brightly lit hospital bed, the smell of iodine and clean linens in the air, feeling her tiny, fragile heartbeat fluttering against my bare chest. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming, ferocious surge of protective instinct, the kind of maternal gravity that shifts the entire axis of your universe. She was my anchor. She was the absolute center of my world. But Elias's reaction to fatherhood was chillingly cold. While I wept with joy holding her, Elias sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair in the corner of the recovery room, rapidly scrolling through his work emails. "Elias, look at her eyes," I whispered, exhausted but elated. "She's perfect." He glanced over, his face devoid of any emotional shift. "She's very wrinkly," he muttered, turning back to his screen. "Do you want to come hold her?" I asked, a sudden lump forming in my throat. "I'm in the middle of a critical email for the Peterson account," he replied, his tone clipped and annoyed. "Just swaddle her up. I'll take a picture with her for Instagram in a minute." He treated Maya less like a living, breathing human daughter, and far more like a convenient, aesthetic prop. He loved dressing her in expensive designer infant clothes and taking perfectly lit photos with her for his social media, projecting the image of the flawless modern father. But when she screamed in the middle of the night with colic, her face red and her tiny fist clenched, Elias didn't help. He simply packed his pillows, complained loudly about how I couldn't control the noise, and slept in the soundproofed guest room at the end of the hall. The real, undeniable fracture, the exact moment I felt the thin ice of my marriage violently crack beneath my feet, happened when Maya was 2 years old. I came home from a devastating shift where I had lost 2 patients in one night. I was emotionally hollowed out, physically aching, and desperate to just hold my daughter. I walked into the entryway, slipped off my shoes, and went to the large coat closet under the stairs to put away Maya's bulky winter stroller. I opened the door. The closet was entirely, perfectly empty of my belongings. My heavy winter coats, my snow boots, my scarves, gone. But worse, the large plastic tote bin that I kept on the top shelf was missing. That bin contained my old, fragile photo albums from my childhood in Pueblo. It contained the hand-stitched quilt my grandmother Edith had made for me before she died, the only tangible pieces of my history. They were completely gone, replaced by Elias's massive new leather golf bag and a sleek, humming, stainless steel wine fridge. Panic seized my chest, tight and breathless. I ran into the kitchen. Elias was standing at the granite island, casually slicing a green apple with a paring knife. "Elias, where is my stuff from the closet?" I asked, my voice trembling, my heart hammering against my ribs. He didn't stop slicing. He didn't even look up. I threw it out. "You... what?" "I threw it out," he repeated calmly, popping a slice of apple into his mouth. "It was clutter. We need a clean, minimalist aesthetic in the entryway. The golf clubs fit better there." My grandmother's photo albums were in there. "Her quilt," I screamed, tears of absolute shock spilling hot down my cheeks. "You threw them in the garbage." He finally stopped chewing. He turned his head and looked at me. His blue eyes were completely dead, flat, devoid of a single ounce of recognizable human warmth. "You're being incredibly dramatic, Jessa," he said, his voice lowering into a dangerous, icy register. "Stop living in the past. You're a Thornton now. Holding on to that trailer park trash is pathetic. It's embarrassing. I did you a favor." My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. The blood drained from my face, my hands going instantly ice cold. I stood there staring at the man I shared a bed with. The man looking back at me didn't just lack empathy. He was entirely hollow. He was a predator who had successfully camouflaged himself as a savior, and now that I was trapped, the mask was slipping. If I could go back to that exact moment in the kitchen, I'd tell my younger self to turn around, walk to Maya's room, pack a single duffel bag, and run out into the night without looking back. But I stayed. I stayed because I wanted Maya to have an intact family. I stayed because the shame of a failed marriage felt heavier than the abuse. I stayed because he had spent 3 years systematically convincing me that I was fragile, forgetful, and incapable of surviving without his financial umbrella. And that terrible fear-based decision is how I almost lost absolutely everything. The escalation of his abuse didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was a slow, agonizing, methodical tightening of a psychological noose. It started with extreme, calculated isolation. Elias began quietly intercepting my phone calls and text messages. If one of my nursing friends from the hospice invited me out for a rare lunch, he would pick up my phone while I was in the shower, delete their text, and reply from my device saying I was too tired or feeling depressed. I would wonder why nobody called me anymore, completely unaware that he had built a digital wall around me. He canceled my gym membership, claiming we were heading into a tight financial quarter and needed to ruthlessly save money. "Elias, the gym is $30 a month," I argued, staring at the cancellation email. "And you just bought a $500 pair of Italian loafers." "Those shoes are an investment for my career," he countered smoothly, walking behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. He began stroking my hair, a gesture that used to bring me comfort, but now made my skin crawl with revulsion. "Besides, you don't need the gym. You don't need those gossiping work friends, Jessa. They don't understand you. You have me. You have Maya. We are all you need. You're safe here. Then came the public humiliation. It was the 4th of July. We were at a massive neighborhood barbecue hosted by the HOA president. There were dozens of people mingling on the manicured lawns. The air was thick with the humid summer heat, the smell of hickory smoke and sizzling hot dogs. Maya was 3 years old, running happily around the grass with a sparkler. I was standing near the patio, having a genuinely pleasant, normal conversation with a female neighbor about planting hydrangeas. I felt human for the first time in months. Elias walked up behind me. He placed his heavy hand on my shoulder. He didn't speak to me. He looked directly at the neighbor, raising his voice so that at least 10 people nearby could hear him clearly. "Don't let Jessa bore you to death with her dirt talk, Susan," Elias laughed, shaking his head with a mock sad smile. "She's been struggling so much lately. Severe mental health issues. It's been really, really hard on me, holding the entire family together while she just spirals out of control." The neighbor's pleasant smile vanished, replaced by a look of horrified, awkward pity. I froze. My chest seized. I hadn't spiraled. I wasn't mentally ill. I was working full-time, raising our daughter, and managing the entire household while he played golf. "Elias, what are you talking about?" I stammered, my face burning with deep, hot humiliation. "I'm fine." I opened my mouth to defend myself further, to tell Susan he was making a terrible joke, but Elias squeezed my shoulder. He dug his thumb directly into the nerve bundle near my collarbone, squeezing so violently hard that a sickening pop echoed in my own ears. A white-hot flash of physical agony shot down my arm. "We're getting her help," he lied smoothly, his eyes daring me to scream, to make a scene, to prove to everyone watching that I was exactly as crazy as he claimed. I swallowed the scream. I looked down at the grass. That was beat 1 of the escalation phase, the disrespect. Beat 2 was the physical control. 2 weeks later, I was scheduled for a crucial, deeply important morning shift at the hospice. A patient I had cared for deeply for 6 months was actively transitioning, and I had promised his weeping wife I would be there to administer his final medications and hold her hand. I woke up at 5 a.m., the house dark and silent. I got dressed in my scrubs, tiptoed into the kitchen, and reached for my car keys. They were gone. My purse was gone. My phone was gone. I searched the kitchen, my heart rate accelerating. I checked the living room, the entryway, throwing couch cushions onto the floor in a frantic, desperate panic. Nothing. I ran into the master bedroom. Elias was sound asleep, the heavy duvet pulled up to his chest. I grabbed his shoulder and shook him awake. "Elias, Elias, wake up. Where are my things? I have to leave right now. Mr. Harrison is dying." He rolled over slowly, stretching his arms and letting out a long, theatrical yawn. He looked at my panicked face with absolute boredom. "I locked them in my car safe," he mumbled, closing his eyes again. "You're not going to work today." What are you talking about? Give me my keys." "You're too unstable, Jessa," he said, his voice flat. "You were pacing the house last night. You're manic. You'll probably kill someone today with the wrong morphine dosage. I already called your charge nurse and told her you were having a panic attack and couldn't come in." "You called my boss?" I screamed, the injustice of it tearing through my throat. "Give me my keys right now, Elias." I reached for the nightstand to grab his keys. He moved with terrifying, explosive speed. He sat up, his eyes flashing with sudden, predatory violence. He lunged forward, grabbing both of my wrists, twisting them, and pinning them together against my chest with one massive, unyielding hand. His grip was bruising, his knuckles white. "You are sick, Jessa," he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale sleep. "You are completely unhinged. If you try to leave this house, I will call the police right now and tell them you're having a violent psychotic break. Do you want Maya to wake up and see her mother dragged out of here in handcuffs?" I stopped struggling. The fight drained out of my muscles, replaced by a cold, suffocating helplessness. I stared into his eyes, realizing with absolute clarity that he would do it. He would destroy me just to prove he could. He released my wrists and laid back down. "Go make me some coffee," he ordered. I missed the shift. Mr. Harrison died in agony while his wife cried alone. I sat on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, the shower running to hide the sound, and wept until my ribs physically ached. Elias had the emotional depth of a shallow puddle in a dirty parking lot, but he was a masterful, brilliant architect of a false reality. He was meticulously laying bricks. He was building a bulletproof narrative where I was an insane, dangerous, unfit mother, and he was the suffering, heroic saint holding the family together. Beat 3 was the replacement. My mother is moving in with us, Elias announced casually one evening over a dinner of roasted chicken. He didn't ask. He stated it as an unalterable fact. To help with Maya. Since you clearly can't handle the basic responsibilities of motherhood anymore. Cynthia Thornton was a terrifying, deeply cruel woman. She was in her late 60s, impeccably dressed in cashmere, and constantly wore a heavy, suffocating lavender perfume that smelled exactly like the embalming parlor at a funeral home. She looked at me not with hatred, but with profound disgust, the way one might look at a cockroach that had audacity to crawl out of her expensive baseboards. She didn't move into the spacious guest room. She moved her things directly into Maya's playroom, stripping the space of its toys to set up her antique vanity. She immediately began systematically stripping my presence and authority from the house. Jessa, dear, Cynthia purred loudly on her third day living with us. I was standing at the stove, exhausted, stirring a pot of soup. Maya was sitting at the island, coloring. Maya's hair is an absolute disaster. It's greasy. Are you even trying to bathe her properly? I gripped the edge of the counter, the heat from the stove warming my face, my knuckles turning white. I bathed her this morning, Cynthia. I used her special tear-free shampoo. Well, I'm taking over all her hygiene from now on, Cynthia said, walking over and physically taking the wooden spoon out of my hand. You clearly need to go to your room and rest. Elias tells me you've been having hallucinations. I spun around, my heart dropping into my shoes. What? Hallucinations? I have never hallucinated a single thing in my entire life. Cynthia looked at Maya, then looked back at me, smiling. It was a cold, reptilian stretch of her thin lips that didn't reach her eyes. See? Cynthia whispered, shaking her head tragically. This aggressive paranoia. You're yelling at me over nothing. It's deeply tragic what's happening to your brain, Jessa. Just go lie down before you scare the child. Beat 4 was the financial strangulation. I had managed to swallow the indignities of Cynthia's presence for 2 weeks. But on a rainy Thursday, Maya woke up pulling at her ear, crying with the sharp pain of a double ear infection. I drove her to the pediatrician, got a prescription for amoxicillin, and drove to the pharmacy. I stood at the counter, holding my crying daughter on my hip, and inserted my debit card into the reader to pay the $20 copay. The machine beeped loudly. Declined. I frowned, shifting Maya's weight. That's weird. Can you run it again? The pharmacist ran it again. Declined. Humiliated, with the line growing behind me, I apologized, left the medicine on the counter, and carried my sobbing child back to the car. Sitting in the driver's seat, the rain drumming aggressively against the windshield, I pulled up my banking app on my phone. Error. Account not found. I tried to log into the main portal. My password had been changed. I called the bank's automated line. The joint account, which held all of our savings and where my hospice paychecks were direct deposited, had been completely drained and closed. My name had been entirely removed from the new accounts Elias had opened. I drove home, my vision blurring with rage and panic. I burst through the front door. Elias was sitting in the living room, working on his laptop, a glass of scotch next to him. Elias, my card was declined at the pharmacy. I yelled, my voice cracking. Maya needs her antibiotics. She's in pain. He didn't look up from his screen. I took your name off the accounts. You what? My paycheck goes into that account. That's my money too. You've been spending erratically, Jessa, he said, taking a calm sip of his scotch. It's a textbook symptom of your downward spiral. The manic phases. I bought groceries. I bought diapers and gas for the car. I screamed, tears of absolute frustration spilling over. Give me access to my own money. He finally looked up. his face hardening into a mask of stern authority. I will handle all the finances until you are deemed mentally stable by a professional. I've already redirected your payroll. If you need something, you ask me. Now lower your voice, Jessa. You're acting hysterical, and you're scaring Maya. I was completely trapped. No money. No support. No exit. Beat 5 was the spatial violation. I came home from a rare day shift at the hospice to find Cynthia standing in the middle of my master bedroom. The air smelled of her suffocating lavender perfume. She had a stack of heavy-duty black trash bags, and she was systematically yanking my clothes off their hangers and shoving them into the plastic. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, dropping my bag, my heart hammering in my throat. "Elias and I had a long talk, and we agreed," she said smoothly, not even pausing her packing. "You are moving down into the unfinished basement." "Excuse me?" "Maya needs a sterile, calm environment," Cynthia continued, tossing my favorite sweater into the trash bag. "And your hospital scrubs bring disease into the house. Plus, Elias is exhausted by your night terrors. The basement has a heavy door at the top of the stairs. Elias installed a deadbolt on the outside of it today. For your own safety, of course. During your episodes." The basement. It was a massive, damp space with cracked concrete floors, exposed insulation, and absolutely no heating vents. And they had put a lock on the outside of the door. They were building a literal cell. "I am absolutely not moving into the basement," I said, my voice dropping dangerously low, my fists clenching at my sides. "This is my house. I pay half the mortgage." Elias walked into the room. He stepped entirely into my personal space, towering over me, his broad shoulders blocking the doorway. "Yes, Jessa, you are," he said softly. "Because if you don't carry those bags down those stairs right now, I am calling Child Protective Services today. I have high-resolution photos of the terrible bruises you gave Maya on her arm." I stared at him in utter, uncomprehending horror. The breath left my lungs. "What bruises? I have never, ever laid a finger on her in anger. You know that." "I know," Elias whispered, leaning down so close that the stubble on his jaw brushed my cheek. I could smell the peppermint gum he was chewing. "But my mother took her hot curling iron to Maya's forearm this morning while you were at work. It left a very nasty, very distinct burn mark. And when the police get here, we are going to tell them that you did it in a psychotic rage." My blood ran to absolute ice. The room spun. They had burned my child. They had intentionally, physically, burned the flesh of my innocent 4-year-old baby just to create manufactured leverage over me. I pushed past him, sprinting down the hallway to Maya's room. She was sitting on the edge of her small bed, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, crying softly. I fell to my knees on the carpet, gently taking her tiny left arm. There, just below her elbow, was a nasty, angry red welt, a blistering burn, the exact shape of a hot iron barrel. I pulled her into my chest, burying my face in her soft hair, sobbing so hard I couldn't catch my breath. She wrapped her good arm around my neck, trembling. "Grandma said it was an accident, Mommy," Maya whimpered, her tears soaking my collar. "Grandma said I can't tell you, or the police will take you away." That was the cruelest, most defining moment of my life. That was the exact moment my soul fractured and rearranged itself, because apparently 12 years of exhausting nursing compassion, 12 years of believing in the inherent goodness of people, wasn't enough to understand the bottomless, terrifying depths of human evil. Beat 6, the ally attack. I stood up. I wiped my face. I walked out of Maya's room and marched directly into the kitchen. Cynthia was standing by the espresso machine, casually sipping from a demi-tasse cup. Elias was sitting at the kitchen island, idly scrolling through architectural blueprints on his iPad. "You are a disgusting, sick monster," I told Cynthia, my voice shaking with a rage so profound my vision was vibrating. "You burned a child. You burned your own granddaughter." Cynthia placed her tiny cup on the marble counter with a soft clink. She turned around, her face a mask of aristocratic boredom. She walked over to me, closing the distance between us. Without a single word of warning, she raised her right hand and slapped me across the face. She hit me with everything she had. The explosive, sharp crack of her palm against my cheekbone echoed loudly in the cavernous kitchen. The heavy silver bracelets on her wrist struck my jawbone. My head snapped to the side. The inside of my cheek caught on my teeth, and hot blood immediately pooled in my mouth, tasting sharply of salt and copper. My left ear began to ring with a high-pitched whine. I stumbled backward, catching myself on the edge of the counter. I looked at Elias. He was still sitting at the island. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't dropped his iPad. He didn't even look up from his screen. "Watch your tone when you speak to my mother, Jessa," he said lazily, swiping his finger across his tablet. Beat 7 was the breaking point. I was standing there in the glaring light of my own kitchen. A heavy drop of dark red blood slipped from my cracked lip, falling onto the cold white linoleum between my bare feet. My cheek was burning with a throbbing, radiant heat. My daughter was trembling in the other room. The man I'd promised my life to was entirely ignoring the physical violence inflicted upon me. The woman who inflicted it was standing there, adjusting her rings, smiling, a triumphant, wicked little smile. And right then, in the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator, something inside me clicked. It wasn't a chaotic, fiery explosion. It wasn't a desperate, feral scream. It was a quiet, profound, internal sealing of a heavy steel vault. The helpless, terrified victim inside me, the girl who cried over stolen gloves, the woman who doubted her own sanity, the wife who begged for love, died right there on the linoleum. She evaporated, and what was left behind, what stepped forward to take control of my central nervous system, was a cold, methodical, hyper-focused observer. A trapped bird doesn't scream, Jessa. It watches the hinges. I slowly raised my hand. I wiped the blood from my mouth with the back of my thumb, looking at the bright red smear against my pale skin. I didn't say a single word. I didn't cry. I turned around, walked calmly to Maya's room, scooped her up into my arms, carried her downstairs to the freezing concrete basement, and set up a canvas cot. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was finally subservient, defeated, crushed under the weight of their combined cruelty. What they didn't know was that they had just given me a war room. The hidden, meticulous preparation for their destruction began the very next day. I emerged from the basement, playing the role of the broken, heavily medicated, mentally ill wife to absolute perfection. I shuffled around the house in oversized sweatpants. I kept my eyes pinned to the floor. I mumbled my words. I apologized constantly for things I hadn't done. I let Cynthia loudly critique my cooking, nodding blankly while she dumped my dinners into the trash. I let Elias berate me for being lazy in front of the mailman, standing there with my shoulders slumped. I became a living ghost haunting my own home, but a ghost is invisible, and a ghost can go anywhere. I had a secret weapon. It wasn't my nursing degree. It wasn't money because they had taken all of it. It was pure, unadulterated, infinite patience. I knew from years of watching wealthy, arrogant doctors in the hospital that arrogant people always get sloppy. They always assume they are the smartest, most untouchable people in the room. During my night shifts at the hospice, while Elias and Cynthia slept soundly upstairs, believing I was locked in the basement, I was using the hospice computers. I was ordering highly specialized, covert surveillance equipment online. I didn't ship it to the house. I shipped it to a secure, anonymous P.O. box I had opened 2 towns over, paying in cash I had quietly siphoned by selling the few pieces of jewelry Elias had bought me to a pawn shop. Over the course of 3 agonizingly slow weeks, I installed 4 hidden, high-definition cameras in the house. I waited until Elias was at the office and Cynthia had taken Maya to the park, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, my hands slick with nervous sweat. I stood on a chair in the kitchen. I removed the standard smoke detector from the ceiling, replacing it with an identical model I had purchased, one that contained a microscopic wide-angle lens. I swept up the tiny flecks of drywall dust with a damp paper towel, so there was zero trace of my tampering. I bought a camera disguised as a digital alarm clock and placed it casually on the bookshelf in the living room, exactly where Elias liked to hide my car keys. I carefully sewed a micro camera into the glass eye of a large stuffed bear that sat on the top shelf in Elias's home office, and the most important one, a camera hidden inside a functioning HEPA air purifier, which I placed directly in Maya's room. All 4 cameras were motion activated. They recorded high-resolution video and crystal-clear audio directly to a secure encrypted cloud server that I had purchased using a prepaid untraceable debit card. For 2 entire months, I watched. I sat in the dark, peaceful quiet of the hospice ward, the soft, glowing monitors of my sleeping patients the only light in the room, and I watched the live feed on my phone. I watched the grim, horrifying reality of my home unfold when I wasn't there to absorb the abuse. It was sickening. I watched Cynthia violently grab Maya by the arm and call her a stupid, clumsy little burden when the child accidentally spilled apple juice on the rug. I watched Elias pour himself a glass of expensive bourbon and laugh uproariously as Cynthia animatedly recounted the exact way my head snapped back when she slapped me. I watched them systematically stage the house. I watched Elias carry 6 empty wine bottles down into the basement and arrange them around my unmade cot. He then took out his phone and snapped dozens of photos, meticulously framing me as a severe, unrepentant alcoholic. I was building a flawless, unassailable documentary of my own destruction, but I needed to know their ultimate endgame. Why were they doing this? Why go through the immense, exhausting effort of driving me clinically insane, of staging photos and burning children, instead of just handing me divorce papers and walking away? I found the terrifying answer on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Elias had gone to his upscale gym, leaving his heavy leather briefcase sitting on his massive mahogany desk in his home office. He never locked the briefcase. He never locked the door. He thought I was far too broken, too terrified of his wrath, to ever dare enter his sanctum. I slipped into the office, the thick carpet silencing my footsteps. The stuffed bear with the hidden camera watched me from the top shelf. The room smelled of expensive tan leather and Elias's sharp cologne. I opened the brass clasps of the briefcase. They clicked open with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. I flipped frantically through the crisp, heavy stock documents. And there it was, a printed official bank statement from an institution I didn't recognize, clipped to a dense legal contract. Elias and Cynthia were in the final stages of transferring $527,000, every single penny of Elias's bonuses and our liquidated investments, into an impenetrable offshore trust based in Idaho. The contract attached to it was a finalized purchase agreement for a massive, secluded gated house in the remote woods of Coeur d'Alene. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. Colorado is a strict 50-50 custody state. If Elias simply divorced me normally, I would easily get half custody of Maya. He didn't want half. He didn't want to share her. He wanted absolute dictatorial control. He wanted to take my daughter out of state, to a remote fortress where I could never, ever reach her, and raise her with his toxic mother. To achieve that, he needed me declared legally, irrevocably unfit. He needed a heavily documented history of severe child abuse, raging alcoholism, and violent mental instability. That's why the $527,000 was moving so quietly in the shadows. It was their escape fund. The moment the family court judge slammed the gavel and handed him full emergency sole custody to protect the child from her insane mother, they were vanishing into the Idaho woods. The money meant absolutely nothing to me. I didn't care about a single solitary dime of that $500,000. I cared about the innocent 4-year-old girl currently sleeping down the hall. My hands shaking, I pulled out my phone. I took high-resolution photos of every single page of the documents, capturing the account numbers, the routing numbers, the signatures. When I was done, I put everything back exactly as I had found it, down to the absolute millimeter. I closed the brass clasps, smoothed the leather, and backed out of the room. The climax of their abuse, the event that would trigger the trap, happened exactly 3 days before Elias officially filed the custody papers. It was a freezing, apocalyptic December night in Denver. A massive blizzard had rolled over the Rockies, dropping the temperature to -10 degrees. The wind was howling, violently rattling the window panes. I was standing in the kitchen washing a massive pile of dinner dishes. I was wearing only my thin blue hospital scrubs because Cynthia had maliciously gone to the breaker box and turned the heating off for the basement zone. Elias came stomping downstairs, his face flushed red with sudden manufactured fury. His phone was gripped tightly in his hand. "You moved my architectural drafts," he screamed, his voice booming over the sound of the wind outside. "I haven't been in your office, Elias," I said softly. I kept my back to him. I stared directly into the tiny, invisible lens of the hidden camera in the smoke detector above the sink. I kept my voice perfectly level. "Don't lie to me, you crazy bitch. They were sitting right on my desk." "Maybe Cynthia moved them when she was dusting," I offered gently, continuing to scrub a pan. "My mother doesn't touch my things. Only you do. You're trying to sabotage my work because you're deeply, pathologically jealous of my success." "I've been standing here washing dishes for an hour, Elias. Look at my hands. They're covered in soap suds. I haven't moved from this spot." "Stop arguing with me," he roared. He lunged forward. He grabbed me by the back collar of my scrubs and yanked me violently backward. I stumbled, my wet feet slipping on the linoleum, my hips slamming hard against the sharp granite edge of the kitchen island. Pain flared through my pelvis. Cynthia walked into the kitchen, casually sipping a glass of red wine, completely unbothered by the violence. "Just put her outside, Elias," Cynthia sighed, waving her hand dismissively. "Let her cool off. Her brain's overheating again. She needs the shock." Elias didn't hesitate. He dragged me by my collar through the hallway. I didn't fight back. I didn't scratch his arms. I didn't scream. I went entirely limp, knowing with absolute certainty that the hidden clock camera in the living room was capturing every single frame of my compliance and his brutality. He ripped open the heavy front door. The winter storm roared into the house, throwing sharp, stinging needles of ice and snow directly into my face. "Mommy's a sick, dangerous woman, Maya," Elias yelled at the top of his lungs, looking up the staircase, knowing our terrified daughter was huddled at the top of the landing. "She's not coming back." He shoved me hard by the throat. I flew backward out the door, my bare feet leaving the hardwood and landing squarely on the ice-covered, freezing concrete of the porch. Shh! Clack! The deadbolt locked. I stood in the blizzard, wearing wet scrubs and one sock. The cold was an instant, overwhelming physical agony. My lungs burned as I inhaled the sub-zero air. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. I didn't pound on the door. I didn't beg to be let back in. I reached into the deep pocket of my scrub pants and pulled out my phone. I always kept it securely on my person. My fingers were already stiffening, turning pale and clumsy from the extreme cold. I unlocked the screen. I opened the baby monitor app, the app he smugly thought he had deleted from my phone months ago, but which I had simply buried inside a utility folder. I hit the red record button. I stood there shivering, the ice slicing into the sole of my bare foot, and I listened through the phone's speaker as he knelt down inside the warm house and told my crying daughter that I had voluntarily abandoned her because I didn't love her anymore. I listened as Cynthia laughed in the background, pouring herself more wine. I stood completely still in the raging snow for exactly 12 minutes. I needed to record enough audio of their cruelty to perfectly match the timestamp of the video cameras rolling inside. I endured the blistering cold, letting my skin turn blue, letting my teeth chatter until my jaw ached with blinding pain. When I had enough, I ended the recording. I saved the file to 3 different cloud servers. Then I turned around and walked off the porch. I walked through the knee-deep snow, my bare right foot bleeding onto the jagged ice, leaving a trail of red drops in the white powder. I walked 2 long, agonizing blocks to a brightly lit 24-hour gas station. I pushed the glass doors open. The smell of cheap hot dogs, stale coffee, and floor cleaner hit me. The fluorescent lights were blinding. The teenage clerk behind the counter dropped his magazine, staring at me in absolute wide-eyed horror. "Ma'am, "Oh my God, ma'am, do you need me to call the police?" he stammered, reaching for the landline. "No," I managed to say, my lips so numb they barely formed the words. The police would just bring me back to the house. Elias would put on his charming smile, tell them I was having a manic episode, and they would leave me there with him. Can I just sit by your heater?" I asked, my teeth clicking violently. He nodded frantically, rushing around the counter to hand me his own winter jacket. I wrapped it around my freezing shoulders, huddled next to the dusty space heater, and used my phone to make one single call. I called my lawyer, a ruthless, brilliant, incredibly expensive shark of a woman named Barbara, whom I had quietly hired weeks ago using a prepaid burner phone and the cash from Elias's pawned watches. The phone rang twice. "Barbara," I whispered through my frozen, bleeding lips. "It's time." He took the bait. 14 hours later, we were sitting in the Denver family court. Elias had immediately filed an emergency ex parte motion for sole physical and legal custody, submitting a sworn affidavit claiming I had suffered a violent psychotic break, physically attacked him in front of his mother, and fled into the deadly blizzard, abandoning my child. The courtroom was vast, intimidating, and deeply quiet. The judge, a stern, deeply serious man in his late 60s, with a reputation for zero tolerance, looked over his reading glasses at me. I was sitting straight-backed at the plaintiff's table. I was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit borrowed from Barbara's office closet. A small white bandage was clearly visible on my cracked lower lip. Elias and Cynthia sat confidently across the aisle at the defense table. They looked absolutely pristine. Perfect. Elias wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit with a silk tie. Cynthia wore a conservative tweed blazer and a string of authentic pearls. They looked exactly like a glossy magazine cover for the tragic, enduring, wealthy family bravely facing a crisis. Elias's lawyer, a slick, overconfident man who wore entirely too much musky cologne, stood up and buttoned his jacket. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice dripping with practiced theatrical sorrow. "Mrs. Caldwell is a severe documented danger to her child. We have extensive photographic documentation of her erratic behavior, her severe alcoholism, and her physical abuse of the minor child. Just last night, in a manic rage, she violently attacked my client and ran out into a sub-zero blizzard. We are asking for immediate permanent sole custody and an emergency order allowing Mr. Thornton to relocate to his family property in Idaho for the absolute safety and psychological well-being of the minor." The judge nodded slowly, making a note on his legal pad. He looked across the room. "Counsel for the mother? What is your response?" Barbara stood up slowly. She didn't carry a massive stack of defensive papers. She didn't have character witnesses. She held up a single small silver USB drive. "Your Honor," Barbara said, her voice as smooth and sharp as cut glass. "My client does not suffer from mental illness. She does not drink. She has never harmed her child. What my client suffers from is a husband who has spent the last 6 months meticulously engineering a psychological torture chamber in an attempt to steal her daughter and abscond with $500,000 in hidden marital assets." Elias scoffed loudly, an arrogant, dismissive sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Cynthia rolled her eyes dramatically, whispering something to the slick lawyer. "We have 38 hours of high-definition video and audio evidence," Barbara continued, ignoring them entirely. "But for the sake of the court's valuable time, I have prepared a concise 3-minute compilation." The judge frowned, leaning forward over his bench. "Video evidence? Sourced from where, counselor?" "From the hidden security cameras inside the reality of the Thornton household, Your Honor." Elias stopped scoffing. He froze entirely. Barbara walked over and plugged the silver drive into the court's presentation laptop. The large, flat-screen monitor mounted on the oak wall flickered to life. The first clip played. It was from the kitchen smoke detector camera. The video was crystal clear, stunning 1080p resolution, the audio perfectly synced. The entire court watched in stunned silence as Cynthia Thornton, wearing her pearls, walked up to me and slapped me across the face with such vicious, unprovoked force that the sharp crack of the impact echoed through the courtroom speakers. They watched me stumble backward, bleeding. They watched Elias sit at the island, scrolling lazily on his iPad, completely ignoring the brutal assault on his wife. Cynthia gasped. The sound was loud, wet, and ragged. She grabbed the heavy wooden edge of the defense table, her knuckles turning bone-white, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The screen cut to black. The second clip played. It was the living room camera hidden in the digital clock. Elias and Cynthia were sitting on the expensive leather sofa, drinking expensive red wine, celebrating. Once the Idaho house clears escrow, we leave the crazy bitch rotting in the basement. Elias's voice rang out through the court speakers, clear, crisp, and dripping with venom. The $527,000 is perfectly secured in the offshore trust. The judge will look at the photos of the wine bottles I staged, and he will hand me Maya wrapped in a neat little bow. Elias physically recoiled in his leather chair, as if he had been struck by lightning. His mouth fell entirely open. His perfect posture collapsed. He looked frantically across the aisle at me, his blue eyes wide, panicked, darting wildly around the room as if trying to find a physical exit to escape the nightmare he was suddenly trapped in. Sweat beaded instantly on his forehead. Then came the final clip. It was the hallway camera. The night before. The court watched in horrifying high definition as Elias screamed at me, grabbed me by the collar of my scrubs, and violently dragged me toward the door. They watched him shove me out into the raging blizzard by my throat, kicking my shoe into the snow. Then the video stopped on a freeze frame of the closed door. Barbara seamlessly switched the audio to the baby monitor recording I had captured while freezing on the porch. The court heard the heavy, metallic slide of the deadbolt locking me out to freeze to death, and then they heard Elias's exact manipulative words spoken to a terrified 4-year-old child. "Mommy is a sick, dangerous woman, Maya. She's not coming back." When the audio cut out, the silence in the mahogany courtroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating, crushing silence, the exact kind of thick silence that precedes the command to fire at a military execution. I didn't look at the judge. I didn't look at Barbara or the slick opposing lawyer. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Elias. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't offer a single tear. I just looked at him with the cold, dead, impenetrable eyes of a survivor who had finally sprung the trap. The judge slowly took off his reading glasses. He placed them delicately on his desk. He looked down at Elias's lawyer. "Counsel," the judge said. His voice had dropped a full octave. It was practically vibrating with a barely contained righteous rage. "Are you currently aware of the severe criminal and professional penalties for submitting intentionally fraudulent, perjured claims to this court?" The slick lawyer, pale and sweating profusely, was physically inching his chair away from Elias. "Your Honor, I swear to you, I was entirely unaware of the existence of this material or the reality of these events." "I am unequivocally denying the plaintiff's motion for custody," the judge said, raising his heavy wooden gavel. "Furthermore, I am granting Mrs. Caldwell immediate, temporary sole physical and legal custody of the minor child. I am issuing an immediate zero-tolerance restraining order against Elias Thornton and Cynthia Thornton, and I am directing the court bailiff to immediately contact the Denver Police Department regarding the felony domestic assault and child endangerment we all just witnessed on that screen." The gavel struck the sounding block. It sounded exactly like a gunshot. Elias stood up abruptly, his chair tipping over backward and crashing to the floor. His hands were shaking so violently he couldn't unbutton his suit jacket. "Jessa, please!" he yelled across the room, his voice cracking with absolute panic as the bailiff stepped toward him. "You set me up. You totally set me up, you crazy bitch." I stood up slowly. I calmly buttoned my borrowed navy jacket. I looked at the pathetic, crumbling man who had tried to bury me alive in my own home. "No, Elias," I said, my voice perfectly level. carrying cleanly across the quiet room. I didn't set you up. I just watched the hinges. Within 2 weeks, the devastating cascade of legal and social consequences hit them both like a runaway freight train. Elias was arrested in the lobby of his office building for felony domestic assault, child endangerment, and perjury. His prestigious architectural firm, utterly desperate to avoid the massive PR nightmare of police cruisers flashing their lights outside their glass doors, fired him on a Tuesday morning, stripping him of his partnership and his severance package. Cynthia was socially annihilated. The wealthy high society women she played bridge with cut her off entirely once the horrific rumors of her intentionally burning a 4-year-old child with a curling iron spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. She tried to flee the humiliation by moving to an upscale retirement community in Arizona, but she found herself entirely alone, sitting in the desert, her phone never ringing. The $527,000 they had so carefully tried to hide in the Idaho Trust was immediately frozen by a forensic accountant during the divorce proceedings. The judge ultimately awarded the entirety of it to me as punitive damages. Not that I cared about the money. I used a small portion of the settlement to pay Barbara her exorbitant, well-earned fee, and I locked the rest in an airtight, untouchable trust fund for Maya's future college education. I moved out of that massive, suffocating house. I rented a small, sunlit 2-bedroom apartment near a beautiful tree-lined park in East Denver. It wasn't a mansion. It didn't have a stainless steel wine fridge or expensive leather furniture or a cold, minimalist aesthetic. It had a mismatched, comfortable corduroy couch, colorful plastic toys scattered across the rug, and a tiny kitchen that perpetually smelled like Sunday morning pancakes and fresh fruit. It was safe. It was entirely mine. Elias tried to contact me one last time, 6 months later. I received a long, rambling, handwritten letter forwarded from his new, much cheaper lawyer. In it, he begged for supervised visitation, claiming he was a completely changed man, claiming he had found God in his court-ordered anger management classes, claiming he couldn't live without his family. I didn't respond. I didn't text him. I didn't even burn the letter. I just slipped it into a manila folder labeled irrelevant court documents and put it in the filing cabinet. The absolute deafening absence of my reaction was the final, devastating nail in his psychological coffin. I had finally learned that the ultimate power over an abuser wasn't in hurting them back. The true power was in rendering them entirely, utterly obsolete. On a quiet, snowy Sunday morning in January, I was sitting by the frost-rimmed window in my new apartment, drinking a massive mug of dark roast coffee. The sun was just rising over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting a warm, brilliant golden light across the hardwood floor of the living room. The apartment was perfectly quiet, save for the soft hum of the radiator. Maya ran out of her bedroom, her bare feet padding softly against the floorboards. She was wearing mismatched fleece pajamas, her dark hair wild from sleep. She climbed up onto the chair and into my lap, wrapping her little warm arms tightly around my neck. Her skin smelled of baby shampoo and warm cotton. There were no bruises on her arms. There were no tears in her eyes. "Good morning, Mommy," she whispered, resting her head against my collarbone. "Good morning, my sweet baby bird," I said, kissing the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her. I looked around my small, quiet, brilliantly imperfect living room. There were absolutely no deadbolt locks on the outside of my doors. There were no hidden microscopic cameras buried in the smoke detectors. There were no voices telling me I was losing my mind. There was just clean air and golden light and absolute unconditional freedom. My grandmother Edith was right all those years ago in that dusty trailer. A trapped bird doesn't scream when the cage is locked. It doesn't thrash against the bars and break its own wings. It stays quiet. It observes. It meticulously watches the hinges. And when the heavy iron door finally opens, even just a fraction of an inch, it flies away, leaving the empty cage to slowly rust in the dark.